A few months ago, I did a video where I showed the difference between the amount of visceral fat in this body versus the amount of visceral fat in this body. And during that video, I said the phrase, "This is not a healthy amount of visceral fat." And most of the feedback we received from that video was quite positive. People were pretty fascinated and appreciative of the visual differences that these two bodies provided. However, there may have been a few comments from that video accusing me of fat shaming, which of course has never been my intention when talking about fat. But I do think it is important that we know the truth about fat, the good and the bad. And we also just recently did a video on all the good essential functions of fat that you can take a look at the end. But today, we're going to go into even more detail about the many different health conditions that are associated with too much fat. This isn't just going to be about conditions like diabetes and heart disease, although we will cover those, but we're also going to see that unhealthy levels of fat can affect almost every single system in the human body. We'll also talk about what are considered healthy levels of fat, and of course, tie up any loose ends about this fat shaming business. So let's get into this anatomical awesomeness. So just in case you missed our previous video, let me quickly bring you up to speed. In our previous video, we learned that fat is also known as adipose tissue, and so I'll use those terms interchangeably. We also learned that fat performs many essential functions that were not only required for the evolution and development of our early human ancestors, but are still important, although to a lesser extent, for humans today. And these functions included storing energy, providing insulation, producing heat, cushioning and protecting organs, and even acting as an endocrine organ to secrete various hormones. And fat beautifully performs these functions, as long as we keep the levels in check. I often say that fat, like many other physiological processes, follows the Goldilocks principle. You don't want too little of it, you don't want too much of it, you want it in the right amount. Now in our modern society, we mostly have the problem of having too much of it. And what is interesting about having too much of it is that fat evolved and developed to deal with situations of scarcity and harsher environments. And now that we live in a world that is pretty much the opposite of scarcity, and we're packing on extra adipose tissue, our bodies, in a way, don't really know how to handle it. And this is where we start seeing the associated health problems that come with excess adipose tissue. Excess fat, especially visceral fat, will lead to a handful of what you could consider generalized disruptions throughout the body, which then can increase the risk or contribute to very specific disorders. And let me explain what I mean by these generalized disruptions. One of the functions of adipose tissue is, again, to release various hormones as well as cytokines. And cytokines are chemical messengers involved in the inflammatory response. And at normal levels of fat, these hormones and cytokines, again, perform their functions beautifully. But with excess fat, these hormones can become dysregulated, and the excess cytokines can promote a chronic inflammatory state. Excess fat can also cause problems with lipid accumulation, meaning fats and cholesterol can start building up in places that they shouldn't, and excess fat can just cause mechanical stress from the additional weight and even mechanical stress on certain organs. And so now we can apply these generalized problems of hormone dysregulation, chronic inflammation, lipid accumulation, and mechanical stress to more specific health conditions or disorders. And remember, this runs much deeper than just saying excess fat can lead to something like diabetes. We're going to see that this can affect multiple body systems, and we will also see that some of these health conditions can lead to another condition in a different body system. So let's get into these specific diseases or conditions that excess adipose tissue can lead to. But before we get into those specific health conditions and eventually into what is a healthy amount of body fat, let's take a moment to talk about an awesome tool that can help you understand your body composition as well as many other health insights, and that is the Hume Health Body Pod. This is not just some bathroom scale. It's a clinical grade body analyzer that gives you much more than your weight. The Body Pod uses bioelectrical impedance analysis to scan and deliver over 45 metrics. Things like skeletal muscle mass, body fat percentage, hydration levels, and metabolic age, to name a few. It even breaks that data down into regions, which helped me realize that I may have a few mild imbalances in my muscle mass between like my left arm and right arm, as well as between my left leg and right leg. So you could definitely use this to address these muscular imbalances. Now, admittedly, I have been skeptical about home devices like this in the past that claim they're 98% accurate like the Body Pod. But I recently had body composition tests done at a lab, and the results were nearly the same on the Body Pod. So I've been using it for the past week since I received it, and I've been logging consistent weigh-ins, syncing my sleep and workouts, and even setting milestone goals that I can track in the app. So if you want to know more about your own anatomy, click the link in the description to check out the Body Pod and use our coupon code THEANATOMYLAB to start optimizing your health routine today. And now, let's get back to those health conditions related to adipose tissue. So back to these specific health problems that can result from excess fatty or adipose tissue. And what we're going to do is that I'm going to give you a specific condition or disease and show you some of the ways that excess adipose tissue contributes to its development. And so let's start with cardiovascular disease. So here you can see on screen some specific cardiovascular conditions like hypertension, dyslipidemia, coronary artery disease, stroke, and heart failure. And next to cardiovascular disease, you can see how adipose tissue contributes to their development. For example, excess adipose tissue puts a mechanical stress on the heart because more adipose tissue requires more blood vessels to feed it. And so the heart has to work harder, causing blood pressure to go up. And this is actually why people's blood pressure will go down when they lose fat or adipose tissue. Some research shows that blood pressure can decrease anywhere from 0.5 to 2 millimeters of mercury for every kilogram of adipose tissue lost. Dyslipidemia is abnormal cholesterol levels, and this is strongly linked to insulin insensitivity. And insulin is a hormone, so hormone dysregulation is one of the contributors to this one. Coronary artery disease is when these arteries, the coronary arteries that you can see I'm pulling up on this heart, start to develop plaques inside, narrowing the artery, which could eventually lead to a myocardial infarction, which is a fancy pants name for a heart attack. And this one pretty much is linked to all four. Too much mechanical stress and inflammation can irritate the inside lining of these blood vessels. And the inside lining of the blood vessels is called the endothelium. And even too high of blood glucose levels or blood sugar levels due to insulin insensitivity can also irritate the endothelium. And all of this creates an environment where the excess lipids can start to accumulate and stick to these areas of irritation on the endothelium and start to form a plaque, which again will start to create a blockage in the blood vessel. A stroke can be a very similar problem to coronary artery disease, but instead of a plaque forming in the artery to the heart, it forms in an artery that feeds the brain, like the internal carotid artery. But I should mention that many strokes are often caused by an embolism, which is a clot that travels from another location. And heart failure can be from multiple causes, including some of the situations that we just discussed. Like if someone were to have a heart attack and some of their cardiac muscle fibers were to die, the pumping capacity of the heart would go down. Or let's say someone had long-term unmanaged hypertension. This excess workload could eventually cause the heart to fail. Even the respiratory system is affected by excess adipose tissue, with sleep apnea being strongly tied to neck circumference and tissues literally putting pressure on the airways or even on the chest wall for obesity hypoventilation syndrome, making it more difficult to breathe. Now, asthma is an interesting one. It isn't caused by excess adipose tissue, but if someone already has asthma, it could potentially be worsened due to chronic inflammation. Because one of the problems with asthma is that the inside lining of the airway that you can see here, called the tunica mucosa, becomes inflamed. And so having a more inflamed environment could worsen this. Excess adipose tissue can also lead to musculoskeletal problems, like arthritis can worsen in the weight-bearing joints due to the excess weight, and the chronic inflammation could potentially exacerbate this as well. Also, many people will experience back pain due to this extra weight. Multiple gastrointestinal conditions can also develop. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is where fat or lipids can start to infiltrate and accumulate in the liver, like with this particular liver that you can see here. This will eventually cause problems with liver function and, in severe cases, liver failure. The risk of gastroesophageal reflux disease can also increase. Now, not all GERD cases are due to excess adipose tissue, but one of the ways that excess adipose tissue can contribute or increase the risk is that excess visceral fat can increase the intra-abdominal pressure, which could then put extra pressure on the stomach and then causing that acid to go up into the esophagus. Risk of gallbladder disease, such as gallstones, increases because excess adipose tissue can increase the cholesterol production in the liver, which can saturate the bile that is stored in the gallbladder and form gallstones that are made out of cholesterol, which are the most common type of gallstones. Multiple reproductive issues can arise through the disruption of the male and female sex hormones. It can disrupt the balance of estrogen and progesterone in females, leading to irregular menstrual cycles and infertility. It can also lead to low testosterone in men as excess adipose tissue can convert testosterone into estrogen. The risk of certain cancers can also increase, mostly due to inflammatory markers and hormone dysregulation. Now, I'm going to address this a little bit more in just a second, but keep in mind, adipose tissue is just one of the many factors that contributes to cancer risk. So it's not the only risk factor, and it certainly depends on the cancer. Mental health conditions are also linked to excess adipose tissue, as this can be tied to low self-esteem and body image issues. But there's also some interesting research looking into how hormone dysregulation could affect the brain, and even how inflammation could affect the neurochemistry of the brain and potentially contribute to the development of certain mental health conditions. And metabolic disorders are some of the most commonly discussed health hazards when it comes to excess adipose tissue, especially type 2 diabetes. But if you haven't heard of something like metabolic syndrome before, this is a combination of conditions that increase the risk of heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes. And for someone to be diagnosed with metabolic syndrome, someone has to have 3 out of these 5 traits: abdominal obesity, elevated triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol, elevated blood pressure, and/or elevated fasting blood glucose levels. And so you're probably starting to see now how these conditions from different body systems can start to influence one another, like how metabolic syndrome includes components of insulin insensitivity and cardiovascular problems. But let's just finish up with some final quick mentions of other diseases and conditions that are linked to excess adipose tissue, and then we can get into what's considered a healthy amount of adipose tissue. And some of these other conditions or diseases would include chronic kidney disease from inflammation and even often secondary to unmanaged high blood pressure. You also can have increased susceptibility to infections due to the chronic inflammation and even various skin conditions. Now that was a lot to take in, and admittedly, I didn't include every possible health condition, but I also do want to be very clear about something. Most of the conditions that I just mentioned are multifactorial, meaning that yes, excess adipose tissue increases your risk and contributes to the development of these conditions at varying degrees, but other factors also contribute, such as genetics, your environment, age, sleep, stress, obviously diet and exercise. So it's important to know that I'm not saying that someone that has excess adipose tissue is just going to come down with all of these conditions tomorrow. Again, multifactorial, and a lot of these conditions develop over an extended period of time. But what is a healthy amount of body fat anyway? Well, it's not like I can say all males at 15.25% body fat are going to be perfectly healthy and all females at 24.99% body fat are going to be perfectly healthy. Again, this is also multifactorial, and there are some differing opinions on the upper limit of what could be considered a healthy body fat percentage. But 24% and below for males and 31% and below for females is kind of the upper limit of where you would want to be if you're not wanting to have a high risk for many of these health conditions that we just discussed. Now again, there are some that would be more strict than that and might say less than 20% for males and less than 25% for females. And admittedly, I kind of feel more comfortable with those numbers for my patients who want to reduce their risk as much as possible and are concerned with their long-term health. But the biggest indicators to figure out what percentage in that range is right for you is what are your health-related goals first, and what are your health markers telling you? And what do I mean by health markers? Well, at the clinic where I see my patients, we offer biometric screening. And this would be where the patient can come in and get their height, weight, waist circumference, and their BMI measured. We also measure their blood pressure, resting heart rate, and even perform simple blood tests for cholesterol and blood glucose levels for screening for diabetes. And I have had patients that have had their body fat percentage at that higher end, and their blood pressure, cholesterol, and blood glucose levels were normal. I've had others that are at that higher end of body fat percentage, and some of those biomarkers were off. Maybe their blood glucose levels were a little too high, or their cholesterol and blood pressure was elevated. And those individuals would be well served to pull their body fat percentage down to a lower range. Also, if someone is getting more aches and pains than normal, having trouble sleeping, or they're not feeling well, those could be other indicators to bring that body fat percentage down. And of course, it also depends on the person's goals. Even if we go with the more strict range of less than 20% for males and less than 25% for females, with the high teens or low 20s, nobody's winning a major bodybuilding competition. And that's okay, as long as the health markers are normal. But if showing more muscle definition is important to you, or maybe one has other physical goals such as exercise and performance goals, maybe you play a sport, or maybe you're a weekend warrior runner and you're wanting to improve your 10K time. In these cases, reducing adipose tissue even further could definitely be beneficial. Now, as far as the most effective way to lose fat or adipose tissue, I've actually done a few different videos on this. One of those, I went into a lot of detail about the fat burning zone. I've also talked about losing fat and gaining muscle at the same time. So I won't go into a ton of detail on this because I'll refer you to those other videos, but I will touch on some key or important points. The data still suggests that it's more about total calories than it is about a specific diet or macronutrient. There are tons of people out there that have lost weight on many different diets, and people will go nuts about this stuff. People will swear by vegan, keto, carnivore, Mediterranean, high fat, low carb, low fat, the list goes on and on. But again, it's about total calories. So a calorie deficit and adherence are the most important factors with losing fat. But I will say that if you do want to hang on to muscle while losing weight, there does need to be a certain amount of protein in that diet combined with resistance training while maintaining some level of a caloric deficit. And no matter what diet you choose, here's another general principle. Try to have most of the food that you ingest come from whole food sources. So minimize the processed foods and minimize the amount of added sugar. It doesn't mean that you can't ever have sugar and have some treats here and there. You just don't want that to be a significant part of your diet. So now let's address the fat shaming. A few viewers felt that I was fat shaming during a previous video when I showed the cadaver with a lot of visceral fat and I said, this is an unhealthy amount of visceral fat. And even going over all the many conditions that we discussed in this video could feel a little intense and maybe even feel like I'm coming down on people that may have excess adipose tissue. But that is definitely not the intention here, nor has it ever been. And in many ways, I get it. I talk with many different patients about their concerns with excess adipose tissue and losing weight, and I understand that it can be a very sensitive subject with all sorts of stereotypes associated with it. So I get that, I hear the feedback, and I apologize if there's anything that I've ever said that has stung a little bit. But here's what we believe at the Institute of Human Anatomy. We're about science and health, not pointing fingers. It is never meant to be personal. When we say the word unhealthy, it's about facts and data, that's it. It's not about you or your worth, it's about the anatomy, physiology, and pathophysiology of the human body. And if there are any emotions that I may be trying to elicit in you, it would be excitement about the human body, and maybe to inspire you to take control of your health as you see fit. And I hope that we really do provide you with the valuable information and the tools that can help you do that. So thank you for the feedback and for supporting the channel, everyone. And in the meantime, stay happy, stay healthy, and stay anatomically awesome.